At the IFA Technology Conference in Berlin last week, the new Sony CEO, Kenichiro Yoshida, promised that you will see the change and the improvement with VR. Without getting too specific, he singled out the issues of motion sickness and the danger of blinded players crashing into their fragile property. Just two items of a long list of VR improvements that I'm sure even the hardest VR evangelists can all agree on. But with 3 million PlayStation VR headsets sold for a library over 340 games strong, Sony's platform is probably the closest that's come to achieving the kind of mass sales needed for one of these companies to push out a second generation of headsets to iron out those kinks. Though it's been 2 years since the PSVR's launch and its hype and major releases are dying down, a new PlayStation console generation is being made. Valve's next-gen VR solution is already promising specifics like finger tracking controllers, and third-party companies like Pimax are pushing out 8K headsets. The next generation of VR is in the works and is on the way. But until then, I've been preparing for that future by looking through those goggles at the past.
What if I told you that compared to their $400 to $500 competition, this $200 headset represents not just one of the best values in VR right now, but one of the best values in gaming right now?
A lot of the flagship PC exclusives like Superhot and Beat Saber are getting ported over to PSVR. Add Wipeout to that duo and you have a trio of killer apps. But once you've seen what you want to see from the PSVR library, you can plug that thing into a PC, and you suddenly have access to hundreds of titles of legacy content, both retro and new age. Old content that can be played from a fundamentally new perspective. It's a struggle, to be sure, but it's one of, if not the most rewarding, and also difficult, modding efforts I've ground myself through.
I came away from it terrified and intrigued, both at the shock of seeing old games through this new perspective, but also at the incredibly complex work that it has taken to get VR this far, and gaming in general as well.
It's a peek at the sausage factory. It's a sobering realization of what fragile, delicate Jenga towers of half-baked features and haphazard hacks have gone into even the most polished of classic games. Not to mention all the troubleshooting of getting them playable in the first place. But every journey has to start somewhere. The first part of the process is installing a piece of shareware called Trinus PSVR that fools your computer into thinking a PSVR headset is an HTC Vive. It does this with some custom drivers that need the app to be running, a button to be pressed, and a calibration process to be completed before it starts emulating that hardware, with the result being that VR software will pop up windows of Steam VR, a middleware layer which is going to need to be running to get any HTC Vive software going on your machine. Steam or no Steam. Steam VR is their walled garden, and going from the traditionally walled garden of console games to this was a bit of a shock. Making all Vive software run through Valve's own proprietary API isn't just out of character for a company that would previously talk up how much they love open-ended systems. Speaking of next-gen VR industry movements, OpenXR is supposed to clear out a lot of this stuff, but for now, Steam VR seems buggy to quite a degree by itself, without even considering what a ridiculous hack you're already pulling off. But if you can get to it through the room setup and get this compositor window up and running, you're good to go. No need or even a possibility to complete the Steam VR tutorial, and I'll explain why later, but right after setting up Trinus, you can already unlock a 90Hz mode for the PSVR that will give you about 30 extra frames per second than anything the PS4 console itself was ever capable of outputting, so long as you set both your screens to the same resolution and refresh rate. The PSVR's 1080p native resolution that you did see on the console is still going to be a hard limit on PC, but it can be improved with super sampling and anti-aliasing that'll also push out a smoother, sharper image than anything you've seen on the console too.
But getting Trinus PSVR up and running in the first place is already an elaborate ritual. I've been at this for a year. I had an old Windows 7 rig, and the program just would not launch on that, and eventually they made a patch and it did, and when the program launched, the headset was at like 50% brightness for some reason. I got it now, but at some point in this process, an entire new computer became involved.
I didn't actually expect this all to work until I got a hold of a new Windows 10 rig, but one big hardware difference with this machine is that it actually has Bluetooth, which you might want to make sure you've got for controller reasons. But even still in my case, even after it's running and working, Trinus will display this slight shivering effect that can be quite annoying, but mitigated by these sensor smoothing and sensor prediction sliders so long as you don't ramp them up too high. And a litany of additional troubles are still coming from Steam VR, this time when they're making the assumption that you have Vive wands installed. Holding down the back button on a gamepad is enough to lock your game up completely, with the screen expecting those Vive controllers to get you out, which forces you to either Control-Alt-Delete out or just remember to never press the back button longer than a second ever. Unless you untick this VR dashboard option in the Steam VR settings, which turns that mess off completely. But anyways, once you actually get Trinus PSVR up and running, you're good to play a number of PC-exclusive VR games, so long as you don't mind starting out with head rotation only. But this means that if the game uses a traditional gamepad controller or takes place in a cockpit, there really shouldn't be anything here breaking the game's expected setup. And for testing, I spent a lot of hours playing the VR version of Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, which pretty much worked pretty perfectly. Also on the lighter end of the setup spectrum was Alien Isolation, which, thanks to the fan-made Mother VR mod, converts this game over to VR with a lot less muss and fuss than most everything else in this video. Though command lines will have to be implemented at some point, this mod enables that optional snap turning for those susceptible to motion sickness, while also replacing the game's peeking controls with VR's head tracking features, which actually can be enabled by Trinus, using a webcam that tracks blue LEDs just like the PS4 camera itself does. And, well, it does that tracking even more poorly than the console itself does. But don't expect miracles, but if you're playing a game like Alien that needs it, go ahead and tick those boxes, play around with the scaling and depth features, and decide on how you want to compromise. Turning on positional tracking increases latency and introduced laggy movements for me no matter what. I was eventually able to line up all these meters agreeably enough to get an acceptable experience for Alien, but spent most of my time in other games with positional tracking turned off. But what about games that require VR-specific wand controllers? What about the real VR games, like Pavlov and Onward, that use those controllers for full-body tracking room-scale experiences? That's where your Bluetooth's gonna come in, but I don't got good news for you. So you can potentially use the proprietary PS Move VR controllers with a separate app called PS Move Service. PS Move Service isn't built into Trinus. It requires a separate installation with a separate setup, and it requires 2 of the last-gen PS3 eye camera accessories. Even though the documentation says you could use regular webcams, I was never able to get that working, and in fact briefly broke my webcam by replacing its drivers with the wrong drivers. That was fun. So I fell back on the next best solution.
The Trinus Hand app, which syncs your phone to your computer to your Trinus to fool your computer into thinking your phones are HTC Vive wands.
Oh no, these have no positional tracking either, it's only rotation. But it turns out that this is just enough support for you to make it past some controller checks and some Vive experiences, like the Steam VR tutorial, the opening menus of Google Earth, or those pestering VR dashboard menus that were previously locking things all up. Regardless, you should probably consider the room scale stuff off limits as a lowly PSVR user, but I'm not feeling too many sour grapes over that issue. Even with those limitations, the places we're about to go mean that hand tracking games are just a minority of the total VR content we're about to experience here.
At this point, I should probably mention that Trinus PSVR is €14, which is about $17 USD. That's another weird thing about the PC VR market. A lot of apps are premium shareware, but that's still going to be less than the $200 price difference you'd get from bumping this thing up to an Oculus Rift, which would still require you to throw $60 on top of that sum for our next piece of software, Vorpax, which is another hell of a hack software injector that fools 3D apps from DirectX 9 and onwards into spitting out some kind of virtual reality image.
Vorpax doesn't just apply the fisheye curvature, the chromatic aberration correction, and the stereoscopic 3D needed to display a correct VR image, but it also shoves its way into the game's eye and eye settings themselves to adjust things like field of view and HUD positioning for a more friendly VR experience. Though it's constantly trying to overwrite the game's graphical settings, and this caused hours of headaches on a per-game basis. It took me forever to unlearn a 20-year-old habit of tinkering with this graphics option screen on the monitor when I should have been focusing more on this graphical option screen in the headset, the weird one that Vorpax invents.
So, by the time everything is all up and running, if you were to outline every single piece of software running in this stack of layers, everything that all needs to be agreeing with one another to play a game on the computer through this thing, then the bottom bun of our virtual sandwich is going to have to be Trina's PSVR. Then you got Steam VR, then you got Steam itself, then you got the Steam overlay maybe, then you got Vorpax, which injects into the game itself, and then if you're me, you're using OBS to record some double-eyed, fish-eyed gameplay footage on top of all that. And if one of them breaks, then your best bet is to just turn them all off and start them all over again in that particular order. And if one of those layers has an option turned on that's conflicting with some other option turned on in some other layer, then good freaking luck finding the conflict. This took forever. This took days. This took days on a per-game basis for some of them.
And depending on what you pick and how much work you put into it, you can get a fairly benign Skyrim VR experience going that is comparable to the real VR version. Playing 2011 Skyrim with Vorpax over 2018's official Skyrim VR basically means you're compromising on frame rate and quality of life features for the sake of mod support, more reliable hitboxes, and for saving a bit of money. Whereas playing something like Civ 6 with Vorpax is just a hilariously unwieldy experience. But the potential scene when surfing across game to game for just some quick testing is really something else. In every case, head tracking is mouse movement, so a blurry gun will always be following the lower right of your peripheral vision. But the sense of scale, immersion, and 3D really add a degree of value to some old games that they wouldn't get without this stuff. It's hard to explain how much more memorable game worlds become when viewed through this perspective. Map layouts get easier to learn, subtle visual elements become easier to spot, environmental storytelling is happening everywhere, ambushes are more surprising, and atmospheres are thicker. You might even notice your brain trying to grasp for some sense of temperature or smell in these rooms. So I gave this a run across a few first-person world-building greats and found that BioShock 1 and BioShock Infinite work fine with Vorpax, but BioShock 2 is prone to crashing all the time? Newer cyberpunk indulgences like Prey work well, though the small text and widescreen HUD hide a lot of important UI elements in your periphery. This is a problem partially solved by the older cyberpunk indulgence of Deus Ex Human Revolution with its 6th-gen console UI that keeps things big, chunky, and readable in VR. That's a happy accident. And I'm sure that one of the first things anyone will try is going to be Mirror's Edge, and no, what a nauseating hack that was. A sense of vertigo, scale, and aerial anxiety are all there, and those are gut drops you can only get in VR, but remember, the game's got no HUD, so that solves a lot of problems. A lot about Mirror's Edge is actually just one big happy accident for forcing some janky VR into it years later, but the game's frequent first-person cutscene animations are likely to jerk you right out of the illusion.
But I hope I'm conveying that even without real VR controllers to play real VR games, you're not facing a shortage of content on this thing. Vorpax seemed like it was able to hook into almost anything, and if it wasn't, then changing the executable file name or making a custom profile would usually be enough to get things going. There is a long list of legacy games that Vorpax supports, including, I kid you not, Morrowind.
Imagine that. Imagine doing your Icarian flights across Vardenfell in fully immersive VR. Imagine feeling lost in the city of Vivek in glorious 1440p that surrounds you with 90 Hz of 360-degree head tracking. It actually works better than I expected, luckily thanks to Morrowind's customizable and scalable UI. The game's graphics won't fool you into believing you're actually there, but it'll be trying way harder than it was ever meant to.
But I want to stress how that Morrowind example means that we have a long timeline to play with here. Morrowind is a 16-year-old game. There are 16 years of these hit-or-miss PC VR results to go through, but what really balloons the potential for PSVR on PC to be this purely pleasant party was loading up some console games that are just as old. And I surprisingly got some really fun results with them too. There is a special build of Dolphin for this.
Dolphin VR is a GameCube and Wii emulator that breaks logic and software licenses to inject VR features into games with plenty of quality releases that stretch across the entire previous decade and then some from the 90s. If a Nintendo 64 game got a Virtual Console or a GameCube re-release, it's eligible for Dolphin VR. And just think on what kind of childhood dreams that makes possible. F-Zero GX is one of the best VR experiences I have had to date. To sum it up, it's both what I expected and what I wanted Wipeout VR on the actual PlayStation 4 to be. And now that this is working, I don't know. I'm just complete. I'm complete. The game still feels faster, windier, more spectacular, and more visually intense despite its age than the comparable releases actually being made for VR today. When seen through the first-person cockpit, it's a night and day difference almost. There's no comparison. There aren't 30 other cars in Wipeout! F-Zero GX proves that Nintendo could make bundles doing VR re-releases of older games. Especially since I noticed that for the most part, third-person games don't play differently at all, despite the wildly different new perspective and camera angles you can throw at them. They may look fundamentally different, but they still play fundamentally the same, just as good as they always did. First-person games, in my experience, are actually faring worse in terms of modding legacy console content into VR. Metroid Prime 3 is something I could never get right. Samus's helmet was always clipping off halfway up the screen despite following the instructions to a T. But the control scheme of sliding an aiming cursor to shove a bounding box to the left and right didn't mesh with head tracking that can look left and right wherever it wants. There was always an invisible rectangular TV-sized bounding box somewhere in front of my arms that needed to be slid over before I could start aiming where I was looking. Third-person games, on the other hand, they actually feel like something that makes a lot more sense in VR. If you thought a generation of HD remasters and remakes was gaudy, I have to wonder if you'd think the same of a generation of VR remasters and remakes. Because a few shining examples in here make that awfully easy to envision.
And one quirk that's important for those N64 and Dolphin games is seeing them with a higher internal resolution than on the original consoles. Although this HMD is outputting a 1080p image that your field of view is zoomed in really close to, it may look pixelated by modern day standards, but those old games will still look cleaner and smoother and less pixelated than their own times' standards.
Ever wanted to play Metal Gear Solid 3 with an internal resolution of 1440p on a 60-inch TV in stereoscopic 3D? Well, now you can at least pretend to. But back in Dolphin, I quickly discovered that, well, looks like I'm going to be replaying Ocarina again for like the 40th time.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm definitely replaying Ocarina of Time for like the 40th time if it's for VR. It's adorable. I wish I could show it off better. If you set up the stereoscopy, the culling codes, the camera angles, and the 60 FPS hacks all together, then you have broken the game beyond belief. But you're seeing a version of the game that is beyond belief. It turns it into papercraft. It looks like a 3D papercraft diorama world that is animated and living right in front of you. It is lit with electronic incandescence, and in a weird way, it's almost more cute because of its low poly, low frame rated retro style.
Goma's eggs squirm with a smoothness that is unsettling, and Goma herself charging at you now conveys an actually threatening sense of that distance quickly being closed. And the few frames afforded to most of Ocarina's choppy animations give them a charming stop-motion claymation kind of motif, which works with the papercraft analogy. But your own head and the game's camera are smoothly turning at 60 frames per second or higher, and that keeps the lower frame-rated animations from looking like total accidents. Its style is consistent. The effect feels like being immersed in life-size versions of the environmental art, while life-size but toy-looking papercraft versions of the character models are reenacting a childhood staple right in front of you. And weirdly enough, that almost helps reinforce the game's themes. The childish wholesomeness of Ocarina's first few hours actually feel more wholesome with this folded paper toy motif going on.
And I loved it. I instantly wanted more. I instantly wanted a more official, more easy, more polished way to play this, and that has me suspecting that there's going to be a market for this. A market for classic retro remakes, but in VR.
I mean, at the bare minimum, if they figured out how to fix these camera angles, the culling issues, the skyboxes, the animations, I mean, there is a lot to be fixed, but there's also a surprising amount of that work that's already been done here.
Ocarina is a game I know inside and out, and yet I've never played it like this before. I've never seen it like this before. It's like going back to your old childhood neighborhood and seeing everything from a different angle with a little more height than you're used to, and I can't wait to see what else I can manage to see in this incredible new way.